Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a graphic novel that I read recently, one that is part of a series that I've been exploring, and is also part of a booktube challenge by my friend Lucas over at the Bits of Lit. This is all about mysterious swamp creatures and the concept of good and evil. I am referring to Swamp Thing Volume 4, by Alan Moore, and with art by Stephen Bissett, John Totalben, and Stan Walk, with art by also many other people. And this was published around 1986. For those who don't know, and I've talked about Alan Moore on this channel before, so I don't need to go into great detail. But Alan Moore is a writer from the United Kingdom, mostly known for writing comic books and graphic novels and of that nature. Like he wrote V for Vendetta, Watchmen, as I've talked about on his channel before, From Hell, and many other comics of that nature. And he's also denounced some of the media adaptations of his work for being slightly fascist. And he often focuses on like characters themselves rather than the grand heroic deeds that they do. Much more of a person focused kind of writer. And I've talked about it on this channel before, so I don't need to go into great detail. But again, this is part of a booktube challenge that I've been doing with my friend Lucas from the Bits of Lit. We've been reading through the series. This is volume 4. Volume 3 was probably my favorite in the series, a really high quality, and I think it makes the series overall worth a read. This volume had a few problems, which I'll talk about later in my review. But it was still an interesting read, and it had some high quality art that I'll put throughout the video as I go along. And so without further ado, let's talk about Volume 4 of Swamp Thing. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Volume 4 of Swamp Thing begins with the character of Chester finding the mysterious Swamp Thing fruit in the swamps of Louisiana, and when he takes it back to his house, he's also a drug dealer. He's approached by one of his friends who asks for it for his wife Sandy. Sandy has cancer and is about to die, and so he's hoping that he can give her some drugs that'll help ease the process. And at the same time, he's also approached by a criminal dude named Milo, who's kind of aggressive and demands a piece of the fruit because of its hallucinogenic properties or something like that. And he also goes off with a piece. They both have trips, but Sandy has one that's kind of similar to what Abby had in previous volumes, where she kind of experienced the connectedness of nature and saw the beauty in everything, and it made her feel a great sense of love. But Milo has sort of a terrible experience where he sees like the rottenness of nature and the horror, kind of a dichotomy there, just not having a pleasant experience and eventually getting hit by a car and dying. Chester hears both of these stories and considers taking it, but we see him go like nah and decide against it as his section of the story comes to an end. It then focuses on Swamp Thing as he's waiting for Constantine to give him further directions on how to stop this evil organization that Constantine wants to take down. And while he's waiting, he encounters a serial killer named the Boogeyman, who tries to kill some people in the swamp. Swamp Thing catches up with him and ends up effectively killing him and stopping him and saving the day. And it's really interesting because we see it all from the Boogeyman's perspective and how terrifying Swamp Thing really is. Swamp Thing also goes to a haunted house, encounters some ghosts, and we see some people looking at Swamp Thing from their perspective. And after successfully helping out the people at the haunted house, he encounters encounters Constantine again, who takes him to the Monitor's space station. This is taking place kind of at the same time as the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline, where the entire multiverse was at risk from the Anti-Monitor or some sort of deity that wanted to destroy everything. And so Swamp Thing and Constantine aren't really helping with that, but they're dealing with another emergency at the same time. And Swamp Thing really sees that on Earth, everything is going to chaos. Like madness is seeping in, and there's a bunch of horror, and it's a terrifying time. And Swamp Thing doesn't really know how to help people, but Constantine tells him about the Brujeria, which is the evil organization that they're after, which is an organization of male sorcerers who have existed before humanity and claim that they will exist after humanity. They've already conquered the physical plane. Now they want to conquer the spiritual plane, walk into heaven, destroy it, and bring back the original darkness. And the Brujeria are meeting in South America, so Constantine sends Swamp Thing to the Parliament of Trees to figure out if there's any answers on how he can beat them. And he goes down to the Parliament of Trees, which reveal that they are kind of like him, and that they were all once human, but through experiments or some sort of accident of fire, they eventually were transformed into tree elementals. And one of the people, Alex Olson, reveals that he was in an experiment as well, and says this is a cycle of sacrifice and resurrection. But ultimately, he doesn't provide a lot of great advice to Swamp Thing, noting that Swamp Thing has to he has to manage his power more effectively, and Swamp Thing doesn't really know what that means, and is unsure if it means anything at all, and so he just decides that he has to go back to Constantine at this point. They travel to a cave where the Brujeria resides, but they discover that it is a trap. Swamp Thing can't dismantle himself and then regenerate inside of the cave because there's nothing inside that cave, and Constantine is actually captured, and one of Constantine's friends turns out betrays him and is transformed into a bird to become a messenger. But luckily, Swamp Thing is able to use the one lone plant to transform inside the cave and stop the Brujeria from doing a lot of damage. But because that person was transformed into a bird, a lot of the damage was already done. But Swamp Thing does manage to rescue Constantine and get out of the cave. At the same time, Abby is arrested for having sex with Swamp Thing. It turns out somebody took photos of it and put it in the newspaper, so she gets fired from her job as well, and the police take her away. I don't know why it's illegal to have sex with Swamp Thing, and there's certainly no laws about that, but perhaps we're going to find out more about that in a future edition because it's not really resolved in this edition. And Swamp Thing and Constantine gather allies from both heaven and hell, including Etrigan, the rhyming demon that we saw in previous volumes. And then the ultimate darkness is summoned, and a huge battle begins with mass casualties on both sides. Eventually, Swamp Thing manages to encounter the darkness, and they have a conversation where it asks Swamp Thing, what is evil? And Swamp Thing says he doesn't really know, but evil and good might have to rely on one another because it's not so black and white as people typically have said. And at that point, the original darkness agrees with him, and the battle ends, and you see darkness and light kind of touching, and a new order being created as a result. And as the series comes to, or as the volume comes to an end, we see characters reflecting that there is going to be change on the horizon, and they're a bit unclear about what's going to happen. And we also see Cain and Abel from the Sandman series kind of talking about how everything is going to change now that the humans have, or this darkness has been sort of defeated, sort of allowed to coexist. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with Swamp Thing Volume 4. As I mentioned before, there are a couple of reasons why I don't like it, and I'll get to that in a few moments. But for the most part, there are some interesting ideas that Alan Moore poses. And one of those is the idea of madness and horror. It's kind of been layered throughout the Swamp Thing Alan Moore run, with Alan Moore focusing on the more terrifying aspects of the villains and the more terrifying aspects of the Swamp Thing experience, including being able to regenerate and just encountering the most horrifying monsters in hell and stuff like that. And so things have been pretty chaotic for Swamp Thing throughout this. He's encountered that great evil, whether it be Etrigan or Arcane coming back from hell in the form of a bunch of bugs, which is disgusting. The boogeyman, who is, not haunting, but like traveling through the swamps and killing people and trying to lay claim to huge numbers of deaths at their hands. And even the ghost and the vampires that Swamp Thing has encountered in previous volumes. There's a lot of evil, a lot of madness going on there, and it's pretty terrifying to look at, especially with the art. And Swamp Thing is clearly affected by this. He's becoming increasingly confused about how he is to progress forward because everything seems to be breaking apart at the seams in society. How can this madness exist if the world itself is not mad? There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. Constantine led me through the Badlands, promising me knowledge but delivering only horror after horror, things that cannot be buried or forgotten or walked away from. Is there some pattern that I should perceive in this senseless pageant of atrocity? Is there some truth that may be divined from the entrails of America? It seems useless. I struggle to impose a structure that has a meaning on the madness that churns within this continent, within this world. But tonight I looked into a man's eyes and glimpsed the abyss, and I fear that it may be bottomless, which is a really good quote, kind of highlighting how Swamp Thing doesn't really know what he's going to do. And he looked at somebody, and he looked into their eyes, and he saw nothing. And he's like, maybe there is no end to this madness that I'm going to find. Maybe it just goes on forever. And that's going to put some doubts into what he's doing. Like, is he truly doing good if horror or madness or chaos can go on forever? Is he ever going to defeat it? I don't really know, and I don't think Alan Moore answers that. I think he leaves that up to us. And it's been a common theme throughout this series that a lot, like, you can do as much good as you want, but there's always going to be that element of evil out there just waiting in the shadows. Another interesting element, and one that Alan Moore keeps talking about, is identity. I've outlined before how there's a dichotomy between whether Swamp Thing is a new thing altogether and whether Swamp Thing is actually Alec Holland. What the difference is there. With me kind of landing on the fact that there doesn't seem to be an Alec Holland anymore, especially because Swamp Thing has shed the body of Alec Holland, and he shed the swamp skin and regenerated it in another form, so the previous Alec Holland was lost. And also he saw him in heaven, so there's clearly a difference between the two. And the Parliament of Trees is a really great section in this because it reveals that this has actually happened to others, that it's happened to Alec Olson and the Baron that's mentioned in this story as well, and a couple of other members of the Trees. It seems to be an ordained cycle. Like a chosen few are selected for what they call sacrifice and resurrection. Like they have to die. And at that point, they are resurrected in the form of a tree elemental and given power to positively affect the world before they eventually make their way to the Parliament of Trees, where they stay forever and wait for the next person in the cycle to do the same. And so when you phrase it like that, it really seems like Alex Holland is only the catalyst, that his death was necessary to give a consciousness to the plants. Now, is that consciousness Alec Holland anymore, or is it just the spark of life that allowed that to happen? I think it would. You can make a great argument that it's just the spark of life. That because Alec Holland was seen in heaven, he's at that point his own separate entity. And again, you're diving deep into metaphysics and the concept of identity and personhood and all sorts of things like that. And that's what I really like about this, is that Alan Moore is really doing a good exploration here in what is ostensibly like a comic about a swamp monster, which is a bit funny. And then I've always noted that, like, oh, well, Swamp Thing has a memory, so that's the thing that's holding him there. But as one of the trees notes at the Parliament of Trees, like, those memories will eventually fade, and the only thing that's left are the physical objects that we hold as a reminder. And so if those memories are gone, and that's the only thing that I said are like, as evidence that this might be Alec Holland, then there's nothing there anymore. If those memories can fade, it was clearly never Alec Holland to begin with. But that has a whole number of problems with that argument, but I still think that's an interesting point to be made there. Alan Moore also seems to be talking about good versus evil here, specifically the idea that, like, it's not so black and white, because a bunch of other characters try to talk to the original darkness, and they say that, like, oh, what is evil? Evil is bad. Evil is the opposite of good. It's in direct confrontation with the light, and it must be destroyed, and that actually makes the original darkness mad. But then here comes Swamp Thing saying that evil and good rely on one another, and that it's not as black and white, and there's some gray area in the middle. I think that's a fine message. It just seems a bit vague here, especially only coming up really at the end of the volume. And I feel like if Alan Moore was going to make a bigger point about it, he should have included it more throughout not only this volume but throughout the series. Which I feel like not enough is done for that. And also I feel like the fact that, like, oh, it's not just good or evil, it's not just black or white, is something that is a little too simple for Alan Moore. Like, he's clearly a better writer than that, and other writers have said the exact same thing there, that there's shades of gray rather than just black or white. And I feel like Alan Moore is kind of like being a little lazy there with his writing. And then I do have a problem at the end of the story. The plot kind of grinds to a halt when Swamp Thing and Constantine are gathering allies. And then Constantine just has a seance where they're like on the metaphysical plane, kind of watching things from afar, and it doesn't really seem like they're active players in this big battle that is taking place. And characters just die because they're killed through the seance, and it's not really interesting. That's not really exciting at all. It feels kind of a weak sort of battle. And again, like, the big battle is a mess. Not only does it feel like not a lot is happening, but also, given the art on the page, the problem is that it's too chaotic. Like, you can't really see what's going on a lot of the time, and it's just characters fighting here and there. Occasionally you'll get a close-up of two specific characters, or of, like, Swamp Thing in the original Darkness, but I don't know what the structure of the battlefield looks like, because the art isn't really giving me a clue of that. So I feel like that whole battle scene it's a lot of points against Swamp Thing, and it's really what prevents me from enjoying it as much as I did Swamp Thing Volume 3. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Swamp Thing Volume 4 by Alan Moore. An okay installment in the series. Like, it was fun to read, especially in the early parts. Especially the interaction between Swamp Thing and Constantine, because I do think they are an interesting duo, and there's a lot more interactions that could happen in the future. I didn't enjoy the end, and I especially think this might be one of the weaker installments in this series. But that said, I still look forward to what I'll find in the last two volumes, Volume 5 and Volume 6. We are nearing the end. It is only a matter of time. I hope there's great things in store. It does seem like this final battle was sort of being prepared for the end of the series, but I wonder what else Alan Moore has to say, and hopefully it's as good as it's already been, because I like, he's wowed me, and I just want to see him do even more to take Swamp Thing in new directions. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Swamp Thing. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this series if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and big battle travels. Farewell.